To me, the balance has always been in investing. It's like save like a pessimist and invest like an optimist. Save your money with the idea that the future is going to suck. There's going to be a constant chain of recessions and bear markets and pullbacks, but invest with the idea that if you can endure all of that, the returns for those who stick around are going to be great. I think that's how you like manage that balance between how do you keep low expectations without just turning into a grump.
Morgan Housel, author of the book Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. It is so great to welcome you back on the show. And Morgan, great to see you again.
Good to see you, Julia. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. And I have to say, Morgan, you were actually my first guest ever on the show. And
no.
Yes,
that's true?
That is true.
Did I know it at the time? Or did you say, I've been doing this forever?
I don't know if I revealed that to you because you know how it's really hard to get your first few guests. You have to get your friendlies. But you didn't ask. So I had you on and the episode did well. But I'm just so excited to have you at this point. Gosh, we're like well north of probably 130 right now.
That's
so
incredible.
It's just
Congrats.
an honor to have you back on. And congrats.
Honor to be back.
On the new book. I know the last time I saw you in person, we were actually talking about the book and that one coming out. And I remember at the time you told me how the psychology of money and the success there surprised you. And, writing your second one, can you just kind of share that with me? Because did it surprise you again? The book seems to have done well. It's a bestseller. I just want to hear about, the reaction to the new book.
I think it was interesting because for Psychology of Money, all expectations were zero. My expectations were zero. Publishers' expectations were zero. Readers was zero. Everything was upside. It was actually like a great example of all happiness comes from the gap between expectations and reality. And when you have low expectations, it's like a cheap stock it's like a value stock. You're like, even if the returns like aren't good, you're going to get a big upside here because the expectations are so low. And I almost feel like for Same as Ever, in some ways it was the opposite because of Psychology of Money success. It was like everybody's expectations were high. And so even going into that, knowing it's been interesting to see. Now it's done great, but it's a different thing when you have higher expectations. It means even if you have much bigger, better performance, it generates less of a buzz for everybody, including myself, than if you have low. The irony is one of the longest, maybe my favorite chapters in Same as Ever is about the value of low expectations. And in some ways, like the comparison between both books is a perfect example of that.
I love that. And that was the chapter. I agree. I think that was my favorite chapter too. And also, the late Charlie Munger, one of his, Charlie Mungerisms too, is like about keeping your expectations low. I think that was what was the secret to like a happy life and is to have low expectations. It's something Alec and I often quote to each other. I just want to hear more on this notion of, maybe it's more of like, we could kind of dice it up a bit, but this notion of happiness and having low expectations.
I think it's just the observation, like I said, of like all happiness is the gap between your expectations and reality. It's so simple that if you have an incredible return, but you expected it, then it's not, then you've just met expectations. It's just the gap between the two. And what's hard for a lot of people is therefore realizing that you need to put just as much emphasis into managing your expectations as you do improving your circumstances. And let's just take the investing industry. Virtually 100% of the effort is into increasing returns, increasing your income, which is great, but that's half the equation. The other part is key is managing your expectations. I just saw a survey yesterday that individual investors expect the stock market in the US to return, I think it was 23% per year for the next 5 years. And you're like, look, if it does 22%, that is absolutely below the lights out 1990s bubble returns. And it's going to underperform your expectations. You're going to be disappointed with that. So like you see that kind of tragedy. To me, there's almost nothing more tragic than a world in which everything gets better and you appreciate none of it because you expected all of it. And so now there is like a danger because sometimes if your expectations are too low, it just leads to like a depression that's going to make you say like, why bother even trying to be an entrepreneur? Why bother trying to invest if the returns are going to be so low? There is like a balance here. To me, the balance has always been in investing. It's like save like a pessimist and invest like an optimist. Save your money with the idea that the future is going to suck. There's going to be a constant chain of recessions and bear markets and pullbacks, but invest with the idea that if you can endure all of that, the returns for those who stick around are going to be great. I think that's how you like manage that balance between how you keep low expectations without just turning into a grump.
Yeah. Wait, what was the survey? 23% return for the stock market for how long?
It was something in that. I'm just kind of recalling from this tweet that I saw. I'm pretty sure it was 23% per year for the next 5 years. It was in that neighborhood, which is absurd, of course.
Yeah.
Like, I think the only other times it's ever done that is like the late 1920s and the late 1990s is probably the only time it's ever done that. And the result of that boom is of course well known. So when people are basically saying, I expect there to be the biggest bubble in history over the next 5 years, that's my baseline expectation, you know they're going to be disappointed.
Yeah. You know what? You brought up an important point about the balance and finding the balance. And I like that. So save like the future's going to suck and invest like an optimist. How do you do that? How do you kind of make that a reality? I mean, is it easier to say than do? Or I want to hear a bit more like, how do you make that actually happen?
I think some people are more tuned to it than others. They're wired better for it just by their disposition. I think some people's DNA, just their inborn personality, is either extreme optimist or extreme pessimist. And even if it's not their DNA, it's been influenced by their life experiences. If you grew up in Germany in the 1940s, hard to be an optimist after you survived and endured that. Just like based off of what you've experienced, versus you and I of like children of the 1990s, I think it's a lot easier to become optimists of like, we grew up in a great period. And so I think a lot of it is just your DNA and the dumb luck of what you've happened to experience. I dedicate the book Same as Ever to the reasonable optimists because I couldn't think of who else to dedicate it to. Psychology Money was dedicated to like my entire family. I ran out of people to it. But reasonable optimism, as I define it, is, look, if you think everything in the future is going to be great, that's not optimism. That's complacency. That's just you're just bound to be disappointed. Reasonable optimism is, like I said, you know the future is going to be good, but you also know that the path between now and then is going to be a constant chain of setbacks and disappointments. And that to me is the reasonable portion of it. So I think I don't think it's a contradiction to say, look, I'm not that optimistic on the next, year, 5 years. I know there's going to be a lot of setbacks in my personal life, in the economy. It's like that for everybody in almost every year. But I know that if I can endure those, that the economy 10, 20, 30 years from now, my life 10, 20, 30 years from now will be better in these elements. I don't think those two are contradictions. They are only contradictions if you are a complacent optimist or like a depressed pessimist. Mm-hmm. Only then are they contradictions. If you're a reasonable optimist, I think it makes a lot of sense.
I love that, a reasonable optimist. It reminds me, like when I had Bill Ackman on episode 100, he talked about justified optimism, but I like that. And because otherwise, if you point out, like if you're just optimistic, you're just complacent at that point. I love that a lot.
Well, here's one other thing. I love the term justified optimism too. And maybe this was not Bill's definition, but if I were to define that for myself, I would say one of the reasons that I'm optimistic about the future is because I know there's going to be so many problems between now and then. And the problems are what motivates people to find a new way of doing things to move forward. And the most recent example of this is, of course, I'm not a doctor. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but you can easily imagine a world in which mRNA research, not just for different viruses, but for cancer, whatever it might be, 20 or 30 years from now, is one of the most incredible medical technologies that we have. And you could therefore look back and say, because of COVID, not in spite of COVID, but because of it, it influenced all this new medical technology that benefits everything. In the same way that World War II, the biggest tragedy of the 20th century, led to nuclear energy, rockets, jets, microwaves, penicillin, like the list is endless of things that happened specifically because of the war. So the reason that you're optimistic is because you know there's going to be so many setbacks, and the setbacks are what gets people's butt into gear to figure out new ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm. And that was the overnight tragedies and long-term miracles chapter, I believe. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. That's really the idea that most bad things happen instantly. Pearl Harbor, September 11th, it's literally 1 second the world changes. That's how bad news happens. Good news is usually a very slow compounding over time. So if life expectancy improves by 1% per year, over the course of your lifetime, that's incredible. That's an absolute miracle. But in any given year, nobody's paying attention to it because you're never going to see breaking news on the New York Times, like breaking news, life expectancy improves by 5 basis points. Nobody cares about that. Even if over the course of your lifetime, nothing matters more.
Yeah. You know what I love about your writing is it's concise and every word has its place and it is just full of lessons. And I have to say, I listened to the audiobook twice for this one. And I told you last time for Psychology Money, I don't know how many times I read it, a lot. And I had all 3 versions that you could possibly have, like the physical, audio, and the Kindle versions. And so I'm excited for people to get the chance to read this one and pick up some worldly wisdom along the way. One thing I wrote down that stayed with me was there's no such thing as an objective measure of wealth and how everything is so relative. And I think it's really important, especially today. So I was kind of hoping we could explore that topic as well.
Yeah, just the idea that look, it doesn't matter from an evolutionary perspective where you're competing for resources with other people. It does not matter how much you have. All that matters is that you have more than other people. And look, if your net worth is $100, but the next wealthiest person in your town has $99, you're the wealthiest person in town. You have the most access to resources. You could also say if you are a billionaire and the only other person that you're competing with has $1 billion and $1, they have more access to resources than you do. It's all just relative to who you're competing with. And that's always been the case. And this is why the average typical median American family, adjusted for inflation, is richer and has a higher income today than they ever have in the history of America. But by and large, almost nobody feels like that because our expectations have gone by just as much. And we're competing with people who have even more resources as well. And this is why, if you look back to the 1950s, it's easy to create this caricature of, the white picket fence, median American of good, dignified, middle class, single earner house come, everybody was happy. And to the extent that that was true, it was by and large because that was an era in which expectations were very low. Because you were comparing yourself to other white picket fence families in town. You were comparing yourself to the billionaire hedge fund manager who didn't exist back in the 50s, but does today. And I think in a very real sense, what has happened in the last 80 years in America is that our incomes have doubled, our net worths have tripled, and our expectations have probably quadrupled. Our expectations, our definition of a good life has gone up by so much that even if we're all wealthier, it doesn't feel like that because we're chasing an inflated definition of what our definition of success is. And everybody talks about and knows about price inflation. But I think a much more sinister problem is expectations inflation. If your income goes up by 20%, but your expectations go up by 30%, you feel 10% worse off. This is so simple and basic, but it's exactly what happens, especially in the social media age, where now it used to be that you compared yourself to your neighbors and your coworkers and your siblings. And now everybody, including myself and you, we compare ourselves to a curated highlight reel of the fake view of people's lives. And so it's easier than ever now to, even if you are doing great, even if you have a great partner, a great job, a great education, a great house, it's easier than ever to feel like you're falling behind. Because the ability to compare yourself to other people who either actually do or appear to have more than you is greater than it's ever been.
Yeah. That makes me wonder too. You and I were kids of the 90s. We're both millennials. I was born in the late 1980s. And just the way we got to grow up in a world, pre-social media, it wasn't until I was a freshman year of college when social media was really coming along, or at least meaningfully. And it does make you wonder, especially this younger generation, do you have we reached peak happiness, or is happiness going to be more elusive? I just wonder about the consequences, especially all of the comparisons.
Yeah, I hate to be declarative about this, but I would not be surprised if the answer to your question is yes, that it's going to be much harder to be happier going forward because the ability to compare yourself to people who at least appear to be happier, prettier, richer than you is greater than ever. And you and I in the 90s, our social comparison was our peers and maybe MTV. And that was it. And now I can already see it. My son is 8 and he watches a lot of Mr. Beast. By the way, I love Mr. Beast. I think he's so awesome. But I can see my son who's 8, who has this idea of oh, if you want $1 million, all you have to do is keep your hand on the car for the longest period of time and you win. Mr. Beast gives you $1 million. It's a completely inflated sense just by one show. That the entire premise of Mr. Beast is let's give away a ridiculous amount of money to people who did really nothing for it. That even just that inflates it. And to say nothing of what happens once you're on Instagram and then you're comparing yourself to everybody else. Jonathan Haidt of NYU has done the best work on this. And it is so stark and clear as day that when social media came about, 2012, 2013, 14, when it really took off, teenage depression, anxiety, suicide exploded. It didn't grow. It went vertical. And this is not a small thing. We're talking teenage suicide. Like, this is not a small problem. And it's hard to think of what the antidote is for that, because by design, it's addictive. And so it's hard to think of a scenario in which all of society just gets tired of social media and says, I don't want that anymore, when it is so like literally rewiring your brain to want more of it. How do you get rid of that? I don't mean to be too pessimistic about it, but it's true when you look at it. It's like, I think the summary is it's going to be harder to be happier going forward than it was in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a parent, but like what I would say, and like one of my antidotes to it would, I think maybe you'll see like a revival in like summer camps that don't have any access to technology or something, where it's just the kids and you get to play and be a kid again. But I don't know what it would be. It's kind of
what's hard in that scenario, even if what you say would be like a great anecdote, the kids who are addicted to it, you know what the response is going to be when your mom says, put away your phone for the summer. Like, forget about it. The other thing that's really true about this is that if you are 15 and you're not on social media because your parents are trying to do the right thing, you're now the social outcast. You're not on TikTok. Yeah. You're not on TikTok. I can't be friends with you. I didn't even know this because I'm such an old boomer now. But when you and I were teenagers, like trying to find a boyfriend, girlfriend, it was, hey, can I get your number? Yeah. Now it's, hey, can I get your Snap? It's not your number. It's like, so if you're not on those platforms, you're an outcast. So that's when it's like really dangerous. It's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, that does frighten me about the future. You know, another area that I really liked, and I was actually talking to Alec about it when we were walking this morning, you had a great quote from someone we both love, and that is Naval Ravikant. And it was this notion of like, when it comes to jealousy or envy, or if you want something that someone has, I really like the quote you had about like, you have to kind of envision yourself like having all of their life, like their family, their problems, like, I don't know the exact quote, but everything. It can't just be like pick and choose. And I thought that was such an interesting mental model for thinking about, you know, when you might be jealous or envious of someone and something they might have that you do not.
I started thinking about this. This is probably 10 or 15 years ago. And there's an article in the New York Times. It was an op-ed. And it said, 2 things happened to Julia Roberts this week. Number 1, she won the Academy Awards. And number 2, she found out that her husband is cheating on her. And so the article said, pop quiz, did Julia Roberts have a good week? And of course, when you think about it, the answer is no. It's probably one of the worst weeks of her life. But the amazing thing that the article pointed out is that 99% of people, if you're just looking at the surface, would be like, Julia Roberts won the Academy Award. She's on top of the world. I want her life. But actually, if you actually take a holistic view of everything going on, it's not. And I think that model applies to almost anything. That when you are looking up to someone saying, I want their life, almost always you're picking and choosing little bits of their life. And so this is what Naval pointed out. Like, most people will be like, I want his body, his income, her personality. But you're like, no, like you can't do that. You got to put it all together. And so I think it's always like that. And the important thing is realizing that for a lot of people, the thing that you admire came at the expense of something else. So if you're looking up to an entrepreneur and you're like, I wish I had his net worth, her net worth, it's easy to overlook that the reason that she is worth that much is because of all this cost and expense that came at the expense of her family, her social life, her mental health, her physical health. It's very difficult to put it all together, but it's very easy to want to pick and choose which bits of somebody's life that you want.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how Charlie Munger said, and I don't have the exact quote, like, the world isn't driven by greed, it's driven by envy. Yep. Do you agree with that?
I think a lot of Munger quotes are like 80% true, in the sense of there's a lot of wisdom into it, but they are designed to be memorable. And so like the ultimate truth is kind of like, yes, that's points in the right direction, but it's kind of, I think what is true is that the world is not, most people are not wired for happiness. They're wired to seek status and success. But most people, what they want is to be happy, but what they are actually chasing is status and success. So there's a divergence between what they want and what they are pursuing. And a lot of that, to Munger's point, is because like their drive for status and success is envy of people who have it. But they think they're doing it because it'll make them happier, but they're actually chasing something totally different. And I think that is the cause of a lot of like anxiety and disappointment. is that you think you're chasing one thing, but you're actually chasing another.
Yeah. Okay. On the happiness front, who do you think, I mean, I don't know if this is even a good question. Like, who do you think is happy? Or, I mean, how do you kind of tell if someone is happy? If like, most people would say are wired for status and whatnot. What is happiness then? And who is happy?
I would say, just to create a caricature of this person, like literally just like think of who that person probably is. It's probably like a 72-year-old living on a farm in Hawaii. Nobody knows, like, no, they're not famous in the slightest. They're not rich in the slightest, but their family loves them. Their town loves them. They have good friends who come over for dinner and they laugh and they have a good time. It's probably something like that. And maybe it's easier to answer like who is not happy. And I think by and large, this is not black and white. I'm sure there's counterexamples to this, but like go down the list of A-list celebrities, A-list billionaires, whoever it would be. That would be closer to a list of someone who is like, maybe not happy is the wrong word, but not as happy as you would think is definitely who it would be. And also, if you think about like the 72-year-old farmer in Hawaii, they're probably way happier than you think. So it's not like who's happiest. It's just like who is the most divergent from expectations, I guess it would be. And I think the famous billionaire has the biggest divergence between how happy you think they are and how happy they actually are. And the country bumpkin whose family loves them probably has the biggest divergence from you don't think they're happy, but they actually living an incredible life. I think that's how I define it.
Yeah, I like that. And maybe it's another point is like, being famous isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And people have this misperception of, what comes with fame. Maybe it comes with some not so great side effects.
Of course, there's all of it. And like some celebrities have done this much better than others, but I think there's also a point of, I think Elon Musk is the most stark example of the reason he is successful, the reason he's the richest man in the world, worth $250 billion, is because, as he phrased it, his mind is a tornado or hurricane, whatever the metaphor was, not in a good way. It's a category 5 devastating hurricane inside of his brain. And he also said, to quote him himself, he was like, "You might think you want my life, but I'm telling you, you don't." And I think that actually applies to a lot of these people. The reason they're successful is because they have paid a price that you and I would not be willing to or not be happy paying. And so I read a lot of biographies about entrepreneurs and politicians. I know you do too, Julia. Almost never at the end of those biographies do I think to myself, I wish I had that person's life. I almost always think I'm glad they exist because of the technologies and the wisdom that they gave us, but I would not want that life for myself. Because the reason they became famous is because they paid a price that I would deem for my life not worth it. The biggest of which is it comes at the expense of your family and your mental health and your physical health. And there's this interview from Musk, I don't know, 5 years ago, where they're talking about how successful he is. And he starts to cry. Yeah. And he says, yes, but all of this came at the expense of my kids and my family. And that's a scenario where I'm like, I'm really glad Elon Musk exists. I would, if I think what he's doing for the world is great, but I would never want to be him. I think that's not a contradiction, but it's something that more people need to admit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point too. And you're right. I think of like folks, I've read their biographies and I think there's more than meets the eye that you don't realize. Okay. Another topic that comes up in the book in terms of things that never change is risk. And I like this, like risk is what you don't see. And you also had a great quote in there from Carl Richards. Risk is what's left over after you've thought of everything. Let's talk about risk and what never changes there.
And it's always been like that. And so people in financial markets or just their personal life, there's so much emphasis on let's forecast risk, think about risk. What are the biggest risks in front of us? In your personal life and the economy. And that's great. Like you should do that. But after you've done that, the biggest risk is the thing that's not on that list. So if you think about the biggest economic stories of our lives, it's been by far September 11th, Lehman Brothers, and COVID. Nothing has come close to the economic damage and carnage that those three things did. And the common denominator of all of them is that unless you were part of Al-Qaeda in the mission, nobody saw them coming. Nobody could have seen them coming. No economist, no policymaker, no one at the Fed, no analyst saw those things coming until they actually happened. Lehman Brothers a little bit different. There are people who saw the financial crisis, but actually knowing that Lehman Brothers was going to go bankrupt when it did and have the effects that it did, nobody could have seen that coming. And I think it's always like that in any given year, and definitely any like 10-year period, the biggest risk is something that nobody saw coming before it happened. And you can even say, what's the biggest global news story of 2023? This is subjective, but I would say it's Israel-Hamas. And even if you are a Middle East expert, geopolitical expert, you didn't see that coming on October 6th. The day before it happened, you didn't see it coming. And so it's like that every single year. And so a big part of Same as Ever is just a plea for like, let's stop pretending that we know what the future is going to hold. Like almost everything that matters in the future are the surprises that nobody can see coming. And the reason that they matter so much is because they are surprises. They have a bigger impact on the world when they come because nobody's prepared for them. They don't have any response to them. It's just like the shock out of the blue. And so I think that's the biggest takeaway from risk. It's not how do you manage it? It's not how do you see it coming? It's the humility of saying, we don't know what's going to see coming. Another quote that I love from this chapter from Nassim Taleb is, invest in preparedness, not in prediction. So if you're saying like, when is the next recession going to come? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. But you can have an asset allocation that gives you a shock absorber that you can prepare for it no matter when it comes. That's investing in preparedness instead of prediction.
Yeah. And I would think that was the chapter, the risk one, where you had the NASA anecdote, right? That. Yeah. Can you share that one? Because that was, wow. I mean, talk about the risk that you didn't see coming. Share that anecdote.
So before NASA and the Navy, before they went into space in rockets, which are like very expensive and very dangerous, they tested a lot of the space equipment in these ultra high altitude hot air balloons. So they had these hot air balloons that could go up to like 150,000 feet, which is like basically space, to test a lot of their equipment. So one of the NASA test flights, it was actually done by the Navy, took place in 1960. And this Navy test pilot named Victor Prather took the hot air balloon up to, I think he went to 112,000 feet or thereabouts, to test NASA's new spacesuit. It was a spacesuit that they eventually used in the Mercury missions. And the suit went up, or the flight went off without a hitch. Everything's great. And he's descending back down to Earth. Now, as he's descending back down to Earth in this spacesuit, it's very hot and stuffy to breathe in. And so when he's low enough to breathe on his own, he opens up the faceplate to his helmet to catch some fresh air. Not that big a deal. He can breathe on his own. When he lands in the ocean, which they kind of knew might happen. It wasn't plan A, but they knew that the plan A was to stick the landing on the back of an aircraft carrier, but they knew that was very hard to do. A very well-rehearsed, well-known plan B is that he'd land in the ocean. That's what happens. And the helicopter from the aircraft carrier hovers above him to like lower this like line down that he can attach himself and be pulled to safety. When he's trying to attach himself to this helicopter, he slips and he falls into the ocean. And this too is not supposed to be that big of a deal because the spacesuit is supposed to be watertight and buoyant. But since he had opened up the faceplate to his helmet, all of a sudden he's not watertight. So as soon as he hits the water, his suit fills with seawater and he sinks and drowns. And it was like this terrible tragedy, of course. He was kind of the first person in the NASA missions to die. And I always thought about this takeaway of NASA is the most planning-centric organization that's ever existed. You don't go to the moon by crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. No organization has ever existed that thought about risk in a more holistic way than NASA. Every single imaginable risk had plan A, B, and C for everything they could think of, including these hot air balloon missions. And they did this post-mortem of like what happened to Victor Prather. And they said something along the lines of like, we had thought of every single imaginable risk in this mission, except for this one little thing, which is what happens if this poor guy wants to catch some fresh air. And so that was a perfect scenario of risk is what's left over when you think you've thought of everything. They literally had dozens of binders filled with every imaginable risk I can think of. And the only risk that actually mattered was the one that was not in their binders, this tiny little thing that no one could even contemplate.
Yeah, it was a powerful story. And I am curious just from, the writing process for you and how you find these stories to illustrate these lessons, and what is kind of your process, or what do you do? I imagine, I know you read a lot, but how do you kind of find a topic and explore it, or something that piques your interest? Can you just give us a little bit of an insight into your own writing and reading process? And I'm just curious.
I think the biggest part of the strategy is that there's really no defined strategy, which is, I think that's the most important part, because it's all just a bunch of casual, unstructured reading and just whatever might pique my interest. Never do it. Never am I like, oh, I want to write an article about X, so I need to go read about it. Never have I ever done that, ever. And I don't think I ever will. It's just, oh, I'm interested in this topic. This book looks kind of interesting. Let's start reading it. But always with a bug in my head of like, I'm on the lookout for stories that I can twist back to a financial lesson. And whenever you have that bug in your head, you see them everywhere. Like you can read a book about anything. You could read a book about like about the history of pine trees, I don't know, and come up with like 5 investing lessons from it. If you're looking for it, you see it everywhere. And so that's what it is. It's just a bunch of unstructured reading of anything that might pique my interest. I almost never read finance books or economic books. I just read about things that are from like a huge wide range of topics, but always with the idea of how can I use this story to tie it back. So the Victor Prather story, I had a kick a couple of years ago where I was really interested in the Apollo missions, because I think like walking on the moon is the coolest thing humans have ever done, ever. And in one of the books about the Apollo missions, it gave a 2-sentence summary of Victor Prather. It said something like, Victor Prather was on a hot air balloon mission and he drowned when he opened the faceplate of his suit, and just left it at that. And after I read that, I think I made a note of like research Victor Prather's story. And then when you dig into it and like pull the strings further, it's this incredible story. So sometimes when you find these stories, it's not that you found the whole story in a book. It's like you found a 1-sentence explanation and then you make a note of it and then start researching it further from there.
Yeah. In the book, you tell a very personal story about when you were ski racing and a horrible accident that happened to 2 of your close friends. And I want to ask you about that, because I wonder, how that life event shaped how you view risk. And I'll let you share as much as you'd like to share as it relates to that story.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you the abbreviated version of the story and then get into risk. So I grew up as a competitive ski racer in Lake Tahoe. That was my entire childhood and teenage years. And me and my friends on the Squaw Valley ski team where we would frequently ski out of bounds, which you're not supposed to do. It's illegal. You duck under the ropes that say do not cross. But we did it because that's where the amazing skiing is. It's untracked. You have the place to yourself. And when you do that, there's no chairlift at the bottom. Like we would ski down until we hit a backcountry road where we would hitchhike back. And we've been doing this since we were 15, something like that. And so one day it was 2001, February 2001. We were 17, and I was skiing with my 2 best friends, Brendan Allen and Brian Richmond. And we were skiing out of bounds. And the 3 of us skied on the backside of Squaw Valley and hitchhiked back. And we get back down to the base of the mountain, and Brendan and Brian said, let's go do it again. And for whatever reason, I didn't want to do it. I think it was like the hitchhiking was what freaked me out the most. I always thought we were about to be abducted. Like it always hitchhiking was always scared me. So I said, hey guys, rather than doing it again, why don't you go do it? And instead of hitchhiking back, I'll drive my truck around to the mountain and pick you up. And they said, great. We went our separate ways. They went skiing. I went around to get in my truck and go pick them up. Long story short, like they never showed up. I didn't really think that much of it. But as the hours went on, we started getting worried. We got the police involved. We eventually got search and rescue involved. Search and rescue went to the out of bounds spot where we had been skiing, where I told them we were skiing. And they said as soon as they entered this area where we were skiing, they said it looked like half the mountain had been torn away. They found the fresh scars of a massive avalanche that had clearly just occurred. Half the mountain was effectively gone. So search and rescue knew this is where to look. And after about 9 hours of searching, a group of search dogs had homed in on a spot in the avalanche debris field, and rescuers found Brendan and Brian buried under 6 feet of snow. They were dead, of course. And so I always have to preface it with everybody, including you, Julia, have lost somebody close to them. Like, I don't think my story is unique in that sense. Like, this is something that everyone has to go through. Maybe the details are different, but there were a couple of takeaways about risk for me that were really had a big impact on me. One was we knew that what we were doing was wrong and dangerous. We knew that skiing out of bounds was risky, but we thought the consequences of the risks that we were taking meant that like we would get caught and our coaches would yell at us, or like the police would yell at us. Or if we thought about physical risk, it was like, oh, you're going to tear your ACL. Never in a million years did we think the consequences of the risks we were taking were that we'd die. Never once crossed our minds. And granted, we're 17-year-old boys. We were not very thoughtful to begin with, but I think understanding the tail end consequences of what you're doing in anything in life is really critical. It's not the average consequences of risk. It's the tail consequences that are going to completely change your life. That was one takeaway. The other is that my decision to not go on the second run with them is by far the most important decision I've ever made in my life. If I had gone with them, 100% chance I would have died too. And what's important about this is that it was a completely brainless, mindless decision for me. I didn't make a list of the pros and cons. I didn't weigh the risks. It was just a dumb, brainless decision. And nothing else, no other decision I've made in my life has mattered more. And I think when you come to terms with that, and that's a truth that applies to everybody listening to this, applies to every single person, that the most important, for good reasons and bad, decision you'll ever make is probably a decision that you didn't put much thought into. Then you come to terms with the fact of how much of the world hangs by a thread. That you can make thoughtful decisions all day, but the brainless decision is going to matter more. For sure, there was somebody who went to work this morning. They left their house at 7:52. And if they had left at 7:53, they would have died in a car accident. Or vice versa. There's somebody who died in a car accident this morning at 7:52. And if they left their house at 7:53, they would have had a great day and gone home to their families today. That happens every single day, all the time. Mm-hmm. So that in itself is a plea for humility of like, when you come to terms with how much of the world hangs by a thread, you stop pretending that the thoughtful, explicit decisions that you're making in your life are more consequential than the dumb, brainless trivia that has a bigger impact on your life.
Yeah. When you talk about like the world hanging by a thread, even you had examples in there of like, the Lusitania, had it not gone, I think it had gone at a different speed or something, you would have avoided war or something. I can't remember the exact anecdote. Yeah. Or like the wind. Oh yes, this was what I think it was either the Hudson or the East River or something with the British ships. Can you tell those anecdotes? Because those were really fascinating too.
So to me, the most incredible world hanging by a thread anecdote is during the Revolutionary War, during the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, George Washington and his troops were cornered by the British and they were about to be wiped out. They were just getting their asses kicked by the British. And all the British had to do was sail up the East River, and they would have captured George Washington and his troops. They probably would have executed Washington for treason. The war would have been over. We'd all have a British accent today. It didn't happen because the wind was blowing in the wrong direction that night, so the British could not sail up the East River. There was a storm that blew in, and they couldn't sail up. And it gave Washington just enough time to get away and regroup, and the rest was history. David McCullough, who passed away not too long ago, but he was kind of like the world's foremost authority on the Revolutionary War. He was asked by Charlie Rose one time, they're talking about this anecdote, and Charlie Rose said, if the wind was blowing in the other direction that night, would there be a United States of America today? Without hesitation, David McCullough says no, would not have happened. So the entire existence of this country relies on the wind blowing in a certain direction in Long Island on some random night in August 1770, whatever it was. So when something as consequential as all of this relies on the wind one night, that's another example of just like, who are we to think that we can predict what the world's going to look like in 50 years? One of the craziest things for our lives is trying to imagine what the world would look like if September 11th never happened. Just take one event. Well, because of September 11th, the Fed chopped interest rates. Because they cut interest rates, we had a housing bubble. Because we had a housing bubble, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Because Lehman Brothers collapsed, we had a financial crisis, which led to those events compound forever. And it's impossible. And by the way, the world, it's not to say that it necessarily would have been better. It may have been, but it would just be very, very different from what actually happened. So since events compound, like the wind compounds into the existence of the United States, or 9/11 compounds into the financial crisis, it's impossible to really have any clear view of what the world's going to look like 5, 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to your personal story and this notion of the world hanging by a thread, I don't know, maybe you answered it, but did that make you more risk averse in other areas of your life? How did that impact the way you take risk or view risk?
I think it probably did. Now, I was 17 when this happened, so I was not very introspective and philosophical about risk. I was a dumb 17-year-old. But I think as time's gone on, I think about it, and I think I'm more cognizant of tail risks because, like I said, like all that matters is the tail end consequences. It's not the average consequences of your coach yelling at you in our situation. It's the tail end consequences of you're going to die if you do this. So I think I'm not that much of a big risk taker in investing in really any part of my life. I don't know. It might be a little too cheesy to like tie that back to this one experience, but it's definitely a stark example in my mind of tail consequences. But I think most things, someone asked me, because I told the story the other day, and they asked me after the podcast, they said, do I have survivor's guilt? And I said, I don't think so. I think a better phrase is survivor's humility, of just like, I don't know if I feel guilty about it. That hasn't been my experience, but humility of just like, that not only could have been me, but should have been me. Like the odds are that I would have gone on that second run with them. And so I think when you have that like humility shoved in your face, it just, maybe like that's one of the reasons why I've always thought economic and financial forecasts are by and large nonsense.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you think, like you're trying to predict what the Dow is going to be in 10 years, but then you think about 9/11, COVID, Lehman Brothers, and like, who are you to fool yourself to think you know what the world's going to look like 10 years from now? I think that's been a consequence for me.
Yeah. And as you point out in the book, even David Schiller, who's looked at like economic history in depth, he said like no one even predicted the Great Depression. Like couldn't find anybody in the course of economic history who saw that one coming. And so just on the topic of like economic prognostication, why do you think we do that all the time? It's like, where's the market headed? Or what's your outlook for 2024? Or where do you think things are headed? Is that just like human nature to want some sort of like certainty or something, or
totally.
the appearance of certainty?
Like no matter how bad forecasters are, there will always be a huge demand for them, because what forecasters and pundits offer is a reduction of uncertainty in your head. And that's a great thing. Like being uncertain is a very painful mindset. It's really hard to admit to yourself that you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So if a pundit, even if you know that their track record is garbage, if they say GDP is going to be up 2.4% next year, even if you know the track record sucks, they just reduce uncertainty in your head. They're giving you something to hold on to. And that reduction of uncertainty feels so good that we will always clamor for those people. There's a psychologist named Philip Tetlock who's done a lot of work in the science of prediction. And kind of the core of his work is how bad people are about it. And he was asked many years ago, he said, will there ever come a time when like we get tired of bad forecasts and stop demanding them? And without hesitation, he said, absolutely not. We're always going to want it. And I think there's a case too that when the stakes are higher, the demand for forecasts goes up. I think there was never been a greater demand for economic forecasts than March of 2020. The early days of COVID shutdown, when the world stopped and the stock market fell 40%. That was when everybody was like, I need somebody to tell me what's going to happen next, because the uncertainty that everyone had in their head was literally keeping them up at night. And if you had someone who has no idea what they're talking about, but they say, here's what's going to happen over the next 5 years, it reduced the stress and anxiety that you had in your head. So that's why those people are always going to be around. The irony, of course, is that in a period like March of 2020, the future is more uncertain than ever. So your ability to actually predict what's going to happen next is the lowest that it will ever be.
Yeah. I also liked your chapter on calm plants the seeds of crazy. Can you explain that?
So back in the 1960s, there was this economist named Hyman Minsky, who was this like crazy crack job, was not taken very seriously. He had like a big wild fro. He was just like this old mad scientist. But he had this idea that was incredible. And it was called the financial instability hypothesis. And kind of the background is in the 1960s, there was this view in the scientific community that scientists could solve any problem in the world, no matter how hard it was. And if you think about this period, we had just effectively eradicated polio. We were landing on the moon. Like it made sense that people are like, if smart people get into a room, you can do anything. So there was a view among economists that we should be able to eradicate recessions, which did not seem that wild. If you're walking on the moon, it doesn't seem that wild to say, let's try to reduce 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. It doesn't seem that crazy. And Hyman Minsky said, you guys are all crazy. It's never going to happen. And he said it was because of the financial instability hypothesis, which was, he said, if there are never any recessions, people naturally become optimistic. When they become optimistic, they naturally go into a lot of debt. And when they go into a lot of debt, you're eventually going to have instability and a recession. So his point was a lack of recessions plants the seeds for the next recession. And the longer you go without a recession, the higher the odds are of eventually having a very big recession. And so the financial, his idea was stability breeds instability. I framed it as calm plants the seeds of crazy, and it applies to a lot of things in life. I think one of the reasons that COVID was so dramatic on society and such a shock is because we had not really had in the United States a pandemic in any significant way for 100 years. So we didn't have any muscle memory of what happens or how to deal with it. So we became so good at preventing pandemics that when one happened, we all just ran around with our heads on fire. So that was another example of calm plants the seeds of crazy. It's the same in the stock market where if you never have a bear market, people naturally would put more money into stocks. It seems like there's less risk. When you do that, valuations go up. And when valuations go up, you're going to eventually have a crash. So just there's always the case that whenever there's a recession or a bear market, people want somebody to blame. They're like, who did this? And it's the Fed, the president, whoever it might be. I just think sometimes that is the case, but I think more often you're this is just a very natural, it's not only natural, it's an unavoidable part of any capitalistic system. That calm is going to plant the seeds of crazy. That volatility and cyclicality is inevitable. And so I think just coming to terms with that makes dealing with these things just more manageable when you realize it's an inevitable part of the system rather than a symbol of somebody screwing up.
Yeah. I didn't ask you earlier, but you kind of alluded to it as well. How do you invest, Morgan? What do you do? What is your kind of investment process or strategy, if you will?
I don't know if anyone has a simpler financial situation than my wife and I. Our entire net worth is this house, some cash and treasuries, Vanguard index funds, and shares of Markel, where I'm on the board of directors. And that's it. It's my entire investing is dollar cost averaging into Vanguard index funds. And that's it. And it's by design, the variable that I want to maximize for is simplicity. And the reason why is the simpler it is, the higher the odds that I can stick with it for 50 years. And if you can earn average simple returns for 50 years, your results are going to be, your great grandchildren will be rich if you can actually do that. And so it's just managing for the variable of endurance rather than returns. And I think to me, it's obvious once you state it that if you understand the math of compounding, average returns for an above average period of time, that's how you actually generate wealth. But that's not how most people do it. Most people want to say, how can I earn the highest returns this year? And what they want to earn is high returns for a short period of time. But that's not, the math doesn't really work that way in compounding. It's much better to earn good returns that you can sustain for the longest period of time. So I think by simplicity and trying to be financially unbreakable of just I have a pretty high level of cash and treasuries, not because I'm pessimistic, just because I'm trying to manage for endurance. I'm trying to increase the odds as high as I can that the stocks that I do own, I can leave untouched for 50 years. Because that's where that's where the magic's going to happen. Munger had this quote where he says, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And so that's what I try to do with my money. It's just how do I keep it simple and manage for endurance? So that the stocks that I do own, I can leave alone for another half a century.
Yeah. We've quoted Charlie Munger a few times in this conversation, and so sad about his passing at age 99. I have the signed copy of Poor Charlie's Almanac on my bookshelf from him, and I have a couple of other Warren Buffett and Munger mementos on there. Just as someone who followed Munger, and I'm sure I've probably run into you at the Daily Journal meeting over the years. What are kind of your thoughts on Charlie Munger, just his legacy?
I think. Look, I think as someone who's been one of the biggest fans of Munger and has followed him forever, and I don't think I would have ever gotten into investing without him because it was his readings that got me interested in it. I think it's maybe more important to point out that he did not have a perfect life at all. He had in many ways, a very tragic life. He buried a child. He lost an eye. He got divorced at a young age and went broke. And he also, I think he had a lot of ideas and views that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. But I think it's really important to humanize your heroes. And so that's why it's even more important. I think even taking all that into account, the fact that he had, in many ways, a hard life and that he had views that I kind of shake my head at, it's hard to think of someone who has imparted more wisdom on more people than Munger. I think the comparisons to the modern Ben Franklin are really true. Someone asked me the other day, they said in a skeptical way, they said, do you really think we'll still be talking about Munger in 100 years? And I said, yes. Yeah, like I have 80% confidence that we still will be, in the same way that we still talk about Ben Franklin. And Munger had a quote himself of like, I forget exactly what it is, but he was like, there's no more noble thing to do than to make somebody else smarter, to give somebody else more information and more wisdom. And I think Munger did that in an incredible way. I'm willing to bet that there are people who are smarter and wiser than Munger than Munger was. Those people exist today. Of course they do. But they have not shared that information and wisdom to the extent that Munger and Buffett has. And so I think it's a combination of their wisdom and their willingness, if not desire, to share it with everybody else. And I know Munger, literally 48 hours before he died, was doing Zoom calls with people where he was trying to teach them about worldly wisdom. And I think that will be a big part of his legacy. It's not just what he accomplished. It's like his willingness to share everything he knew about it with everyone. That's what sticks out.
Yeah. I always loved how it was like, the Daily Journal meetings. You'd always call us the groupies. That was my favorite meeting, was to go to the Daily Journal, and which was just, the solo Munger Q&A. And I agree with you. I learned so much from him. And I think you're right. I think in 100 years, people will still be quoting him, and what an impactful life. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I love your books so much. I love The Psychology of Money. I love Same as Ever. I feel like your writing has had an impact on my life. You've gotten me to see things or think about things. So this is going to be a compound question. What do you want readers to take away from the book? And how has writing both of the books, how has that impacted or changed you or reinforced how you see things?
I'll take the first part. And maybe this is an answer that you are not expecting, but I never think about that, what readers might take away from it. On my blog, I don't have an editor at all. I'm a one-man band, for better or worse. There's usually a couple typos in there, but it's just me. For the books, the publisher will go through it. I'm very picky about what editors can and can't do to my writing, but it's really interesting for me because sometimes the editors will say, oh, you should explain this paragraph better for readers. And whenever they do that, I'm like, the reader? Like the who? Like what? I've always thought that I just write for myself. And I think everything that I write is almost like my diary of like, I'm just trying to figure out these things for myself. And I never think, what do I want the reader to take out of this? It honestly does not cross my mind. And I want to think in most areas in life, I'm a pretty selfless person. I want to help other people. But for writing, I'm like, this is just me. This is just my paint. And I actually think a lot of artists, and I think writing is an art, are like that. Like, do most painters think about what other people are going to think of their paintings? Or are they just like, this is what I want to paint? Like if Picasso was thinking about what other people wanted to see, he would not paint their ears on the chin or whatever he did. So I think I always just think about, I'm just writing for an audience of one, which is myself. And maybe to the second part of your question, which is like, how has it impacted me? In a profound way. Everything I know is something that I learned because I was trying to write about it. I think there was a big misconception for every author that author had all of the information in their head and they just sat down at a keyboard and spilled it out. And that is almost never true. That when somebody starts a book or starts a blog post or whatever it might be, they don't know much of anything about that topic. And the process of writing is how they learn. And so that's how it's always been for me. When I start a blog, when I start a chapter, I don't know much of anything about that topic. And the process of writing is how I learned it. And so you write one sentence and then you're like, oh, that reminds me of this other thing. I need to go like look into that. Oh, I wrote this paragraph and that reminds me of this book I read 3 years ago. Let me go like try to find that information to try to tie it in here. The process of writing is what teaches you. And so that's, I feel like the biggest benefactor of my writing has been myself. Maybe that sounds weird. I don't know if that sounds egotistical, but I feel like that's really what it's been.
It's not at all. Morgan, this has been an absolute pleasure. Before I let you go, will you let folks know where they can find you? Maybe on Twitter or X, whatever. X nowadays. If they,
I'm
they
still
can find
calling
your
it
blog. Twitter. I still call it Twitter too. Let folks know where they can find you, follow you, read more of your work, and of course, folks, go pick up the book.
Yeah, you will pry the word Twitter from my cold dead hands. So you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Morgan Housel, my first and last name.
I love it. Well, Morgan Housel, author of Same as Ever. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, your ideas, and all of your wisdom. And it was great to see you again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Good seeing you. Thanks, Julia.